Welcome, everyone. This is the 10th webinar in the Navigating the Turbulence of COVID-19 webinar series. My name is Katie Montgomery, and I am the Associate Dean for Degree Programs, and we are very excited to have you here today for the crisis of organizational change, what happened to our dynamic capabilities. And so I'm very excited to welcome our speaker today. It is Professor Michael Jarrett. He is a professor of management practice and organizational behavior. He is an expert and a thought leader in organizational change, leadership, management change. He has great experience in higher education. He currently is a program director for our executive and masters in change at INSEAD, but he also has experience at London Business School and Cranfield University. But even more exciting is he's not just great in the classroom, he's also been out in the consulting world. He has extensive experience with lots of different industries, including pharmaceuticals at Novartis, banking at Barclays, and even consulting at PwC. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Michael Jarrett, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say today.
Thank you very much, Katie. Welcome, everybody. It's really great to be here this evening in Singapore. So today I would like to cover a number of areas, particularly a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, I think it's important for us just to acknowledge the health workers across the world. I'm very excited also to hear from people from France here, bonjour, from the United States very early in the morning. I'm very impressed with that. We've got some local people from Singapore. Assalamu alaikum from our colleagues from UAE, from India, namaste, also the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Spain, among many others. So I'm really glad that you're all here. And this is very much part of what we expect from INSEAD, a real diverse community. So let me say a little bit about what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to say a little bit about what is it that's happening here? We call it an environmental jolt. It's been dubbed as COVID-19, and I want to make sense of this because it begins to create a narrative about the nature of the organizational change that we're all facing. And clearly, many of the things I'm talking about today can apply both to you as individuals, it could apply to as teams, but obviously my focus is more organizational. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Secondly, I'm going to say, well, what does change theory have to say about this? We're all probably familiar with an old school thought of Kurt Lewin, who talked about unfreeze, change, and refreeze. Has change has anything more to say about this? And I'm glad to say it does. And what I want to do is to compare current theories of change with what's actually happening and how does that actually help us. So a bit of theory, but also lots of examples, as Katie said, about practice, about what people can actually do. And then finally, yes, I'm a professor in organizational behavior, so I'm going to talk about the psychology of stuff, of course. And I'd like to spend quite some time on that, thinking about what does it mean for me? What does it mean for people around me? And what does this mean in terms of the psychological aspects? So we're going to do a whistle-stop tour through the big picture, through to organizations, and filter down, hopefully, to many of you who are leaders and also working across different industries. So without further ado, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so I want to start off with this little story, which I think is embellic of what is it I'm trying to say. So on my left, and I hope on your left as well, there's a bunch of banks. In 2008, you will remember, was the beginning of the financial crisis. And I used to run a small consulting firm where we had a little tool called the changeability tool. And what this did was tell you whether you were able to change or not. Anyway, one of these banks came up and said, oh, such an interesting tool. Would you please come and talk to us? So we did. And after 2 or 3 weeks of lots of negotiation, discussion, they says, you know what? We don't need it. It's fine. We're fine. We will survive. It was one of the banks, and in fact, I think not all of them there. It was one of those banks that then got a huge amount of money, both from the UK government as well as from the British taxpayer. And so that's one example of how people deal with change. They don't. Or by the time they come to us, it's already too late. On the other side, we've got Wimbledon, and you must be asking me, what has Wimbledon got to do with change management? For those that you would know me, I really love tennis. Roland Garros, Wimbledon, the US Open. I love tennis. And so it was quite a gift to get this little story. In 2003, 2004, they took out an insurance against a COVID virus. Yes, they paid 4 million every single year since then. And guess what? If we move to the next slide, they are now, unlike the Olympics, unlike many other sports, they are now receiving 141 million payout after taking out insurance specifically for a pandemic. The reason I bring these two is like I think they're metaphors about how people deal with change. On one hand, there are those who really don't see it coming until it's far too late, even beyond that point, and are in panic. And on the other hand, there are these people, 2003, this is 17 years ahead, looking forward and thinking, you know what, I think we should cover this. And this is I feel like this theme of how we deal with change is going to be current throughout the whole of the session. So let's move on to the next piece. So my first point then is, if we move on to the next one, is the idea that the way in which we look at the world is in fact socially constructed. Here we go. So COVID-19 has taken place. This is something we all know. It's been a crisis of huge amounts. It's affected people in lots of different ways. From countries, 75% has been from the US and Europe. By income group, those who are lower on incomes have been more severely impacted by this, small business rather than large business. And so what I'd like to do is ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does this concern you? And unfortunately, we can only ask you, we have to ask you at different levels. So there are like 6 questions here. So I do apologize for this, but it's really just to get you to have an insight as to what is really troubling people at the moment. We have people from across the world. It would just be very interesting to see what is going on. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to just quickly tap through these questions. As you're doing that, we'll move to the next slide, which gives us a breakdown of where things are happening. So as a headline on the left, we've got the total cases. As you can see, there are over 3.5 million cases, 3,641,692 as of this morning. Recovered, yeah, there's 1 million there. And there's an active cases of just over 2 million. And of those, 98% of them are mild cases as opposed to severe. And then deaths, sadly, there are 250,000 worldwide. And these are the headline figures that we get on a daily basis, with the US leading the trail here. Spain, Italy, UK, France, with Belgium in terms of total cases, the lowest of the top 13. Sorry, I like prime and unusual numbers. On the right-hand side, what we see now is per capita, per million. And the reason I thought I'd choose it this way is because it gives us a slightly different story. So here we see Spain and Italy, which have had the most severe incidence of these. And yet on the far right, where Belgium, as you can see, had a very low total incidence, actually per capita is much higher, both in terms of deaths and in terms of incidences. Overall, this says, and I want to make this, and we know it's reality, this is bad news. Yeah. However, on the other hand, I want to also say how we respond to threat depends upon how we react. And what I want to argue, first of all, is to say the way in which threat has been narrated, both in the press and among us, in some way doesn't help. And let me just move to the next phase, the next slide. So the language of crisis has been about financial crisis, it's unprecedented, it's apocalyptic, I've even heard said, it's a black swan, I've heard said. And in some ways, this in fact creates a sense of panic. And what we know about what we call threat response is that, one, we first of all think, is this good or is it bad? But more importantly, the secondary element is, what can I do about it? Do I feel I have a sense of agency? So what we have here is the first set of results, sharing how worried people feel about it at a country level. It seems that most people feel a bit at a country level rather than anything else. I wonder if can we get the other slides up, the other responses? Is that possible? No, it isn't. Okay.
Michael, I'm wondering if I could, ask a question, because we're clearly seeing, on the scale of 1 to 10, people being more towards very worried. And, and with your expertise with leadership, how do people, or how do leaders balance their own psychological needs, but at the same time, those of their employees, which I think is interesting looking at the slide about your country. That's thinking about on a larger scale. It's more than just yourself. How do you take care of yourself as a leader and those that you manage and lead?
So in fact, I'm going to talk about that towards the end of the session, but let me give you a quick response to that. So when we are faced with threat, our natural response is either to literally withdraw, pull away, or for the mad people among us, we actually dive into it. We actually love the risk. These are not the norm, I have to say. Most people actually pull back. They tend to be defensive and tend to want to walk away from it. Yeah. This is an issue, I think, for leadership, because most leaders are probably in that same, and they think more about themselves, which has an impact both on the way that they manage the teams and also the types of decisions we make. And so in those early phases, people can sometimes get numb, or sometimes what they can do is literally psychologically shut down. This is bad news. For those leaders who have a self-awareness and some sense of what impact this has, and this can be a way in which we could change both the internal narrative as well as how we can reach out to the people around us. But what I'd like to do, though, is to come back to that in more depth later, if I may, and then come back to the kind of questions about crisis and how we manage that. So the first thing is that it's not the first time we've had pandemics. Russian flu, the Spanish flu, Asian flu, SARS, AIDS, and now we have COVID-19. And what's interesting also is even the numbers here are huge compared to at the moment. So there are two things going on. One is the health issue, and the other one is the economic one. I think the fact that we have both, which is what's causing the issue. People talk about it being unprecedented. And I go back to the Spanish flu because it's very interesting. They had a person called Dr. Tootle at the time who has taken up in many ways the same role as Fauci has taken up. He talked about social distancing. He talked about covering oneself up. He talked about how we can develop, what they call it, quarantine, and also a little bit about using masks. It's just quite interesting that history in some way is repeating itself. And this is why the comment that it's not unprecedented, I think is relevant. And then finally, if we move on to the next slide, here's a couple of things which I think are significant. So one, in 2020, 26th of January, there was an academic paper which said, in fact, this could be a pandemic. So that's as early as the end of January, where actually we could have taken something, could have taken action as a world. And I'm not blaming any country at all here. Just as a world, we could have done something. Nassim Taleb, who many of you will be familiar with his work, he wrote the book in Don't Be Fooled by Randomness, also The Black Swan, and he actually says this is not a black swan. By that, it's not a rare event, and it's not uncontrollable. And a couple of partners from Bain & Co. last year, I think in June 2019, yes, they said, look, it's been a pretty good run. We're going to have a downturn. And all of these things happen. Unfortunately, they happen together, which makes it more challenging. Now, the point I really want to make here is that several things. One, we are having a difficult time, but we have had experience before. If we can accept that, what it means is, therefore, we can learn from our previous experience. And this answers already some of the questions that people are asking about. We saw some pre-questions about what should leaders do. So one thing is to tap into prior experience. The second thing is, and I know this is obviously sounds easier said than done, not to panic. And I'll say a little bit about that in a while. And then the third thing is to think about in what ways can I have agency? So in what ways can I take control as opposed to being controlled by what I describe as a narrative that we have, there's nothing that we can do. So if we
Michael, we've
move
got
on then.
interesting question. It
Yeah.
seems as though when they saw the data, people were much more worried and anxious about, country and large scale than they were about, themselves personally. And someone commented, is that potentially a form of denial? But then it's really interesting when you come to this slide, we've been there before. People predicted it. So do we have, as individuals, are we in denial? And what about larger organizations? And what is your comment regarding that?
So my prediction was that people would say they were more concerned about themselves than for the country as a whole. There are multiple ways I can interpret that. So one way, it could be denial. So it's, if I think about it for me, it becomes overwhelming. So actually I project it out there. So that's one way in which we can describe it. Another way we can think about it is people, therefore maybe connected to the school in some way. We've had classes and lessons about this. I know how to manage this, and therefore it's the bigger issues that I'm concerned about. It could be that people are from either different demographics or from different professions. So for example, we know if you're in IT, if you're in telecoms, if you're in fast food or Netflix, for example, you're going to be a survivor naturally because of the structure that you're in. Whereas if you're running a small enterprise, perhaps in India, in Uttar Pradesh or something like that, then you're going to be much closer to the ground about what it means. So there are a number of different interpretations. Denial could be one of them, but there could also be some structural ones as well. If we move on to the next slide, then I'm going to talk a little bit about this thing called dynamic capabilities. Exactly what are they? And I want to start off with understanding what do we mean by change and the different types of changes that there are. Next slide, please. Thank you. So organizational change, you've all probably done some class or the other which says it's the deliberate activities which moves us from where we are now, the present, to some desired state in the future. And hopefully that is better than now. That in itself sounds easy, but people often prefer, going back to your earlier point, Katie, in the question, to live in the present, even though it's unpleasant, it's familiar, than to go into the uncertainty of a better state. There are different types of change, and there are several models I could have used, but I've chosen to use a particular one because it speaks to the COVID situation. So if we could just set up, So we know that change can either be incremental at the top or strategic, meaning manageable, small, ways in which we can do things in a controllable way, versus strategic, which is changing strategy, leadership, the very mission of the organization. On the other side, it can be both anticipatory or reactionary. So if it's anticipatory, maybe a new legal requirement is coming in, we can fine tune. It's something we've done before, it's quite easy. Whereas if it's reactive, then we tend to be adaptive. So we're responding to the external dimensions. We look around to see what other people are doing, and we tend to imitate them in some way. And I'll talk about that in more detail with examples later. We can also be reactive and strategic. And when we're in that space, which I think is where we are now, this is a radical transformation. This is something which we did not expect. It's shocking. We're in crisis and we don't know what to do. I've chosen airlines of the past, but it could be the auto car industry, or it could be Uber coming in. These are things which we just really didn't expect. And then there's anticipatory and strategic. This is strategic organizational change. So in telecoms, you think of when 3G was launched, it was launched around contracts, and then later we now have different people presenting themselves who are going to present G5. So the question is, if you think about the changes that you're in now, which one of these most reflects your current situation? Just choose one of them. Okay, let's move on to this thing called dynamic capabilities then. What does it actually mean? So dynamic capabilities is how we respond to change by adapting, integrating and reconfiguring what we do, both internally within the organization and externally. So the first part of it is scanning. This is such an important part. So this is looking outside, trying to interpret the data and creating opportunities. So our example would be, I always think of Goldman Sachs looking way out and identifying this thing called bricks. Yeah. Or if we go back to our original example of Wimbledon, where they sense the environment and think about looking out. So this is something you should do before the change takes place. So at some level, we're already too late, but what we can learn from this is that something we can do looking forward. So people, for example, in Korea, where they have managed the crisis quite well, as has Taiwan, look back and said, okay, what could we learn from what we did in the past, particularly around SARS, for example. The next phase is, having made sense of the environment, is then to, if you like, seize the opportunity. And there are three ways we can do this: products, processes, and services. We're looking at clients. Here we'll typically explore what are the things that we're looking for. Let's have a look at this. A new product. And obviously this will take time. So one thing that people are doing now, as we've seen, is move from, if you're a small companies, to go online, you know, to offer things online. And typically you should have been doing that in some ways already. The second thing is around, sometimes you're stuck by what you're already doing. So that really locks you in. And what we found from some studies is that some people are unable to do this and hopefully look for other alternatives, either a bailout, a loan, or something like that. And then finally, there's what we call to reconfigure, to shape what actually takes place. And this is trying to find a new way of reconfiguring your internal resources. So it might be, for example, reducing the number of plants, but increasing the number of employees. It might be something to do with the way we govern things, or it might be to do with processes. So dynamic capabilities is around sensing, seizing, and shaping. And these are examples which we'll go into in more detail. I'm wondering if we could see the poll to see where we're at of where people 1, 2, 3, or 4. Katie, you might have a comment.
Yes, so I think number 2 was the leader. We had about 33%. And so it was the leader in terms of the last poll.
So incremental in some ways, but anticipatory. That's really interesting, isn't it? And number 3 is only 31%, which again, you'd expect that to be higher in this. So we're beginning to say we have an interesting population here. You know, they're not, well, I think so. I mean, even if most of the countries that we've got here are from the US or Europe, even that aside, which have had the brunt of this, both economically, maybe, but particularly from a health point of view, seemingly managing it quite well. So in many ways, I should be asking, what are you doing to make it successful? So let's move on to the next slide, please. There are winners and losers in this, and there's no doubt about that. So I wish we had more time. I'm curious to know who's in streaming, Netflix, you know, who's in telecoms, conferencing, who's in e-learning, who's in pharmaceuticals. I mean, these are all the industries which are in fact doing really well. And it's not necessarily that they were able to change. So let's be clear about this. Some of them just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Some of them had done the scanning years ago. So I take Netflix, which looks like, hey, that was opportune, wasn't it? But hey, remember Blockbuster? Yeah, they took over Blockbuster. Or Amazon, when they first came out, we said, books online, why would we need that? Yeah. So in some ways, they're reaping the advantages of looking ahead 20 years before. And this is what it takes. And this is why I think this scanning and looking ahead is really, really important and undervalued. Yeah. On the other side, there are some obvious cases. So transport, banking is not doing so well, retail, both consumables as well as luxury retail, cooking. So again, oil, it's very interesting, as you know, they were actually giving it away the other day, which was a way in which they recombined their resources, didn't they? They said, okay, we actually, it makes better sense for us to give it away than to hold it because it's costly to hold it. Yeah. Airlines, the reason they're still going, as some of you may know, so one of our clients, and I don't know if I could say which country, because it's one of the people here, is actually in a country running maintenance in an airline. They still have to keep these going, because if they don't, it's too costly to shut it down and redo it again. So that's trying to think of ways of keeping things going for the future. And hotels, obviously, the only hotel we're in at the moment is our homes, and I guess people are unable to do that. I suppose we're all looking forward to that when the lockdown comes through. So there are winners and losers, is the point I'm making. Yeah.
And a lot of these examples are companies, that existed, they're large scale. What happens to the entrepreneur or the startup, in this space? What are we seeing in terms of companies that are maybe not yet established?
Well, it's interesting. So there's one of the things I've discovered, there's no systematic research about how people are managing crisis. So I went back and looked at how did people manage this in a previous crisis during the global financial crisis, and people did that. So Tesla, for example, they created this space. Now there are a number of factors that they had, though. So they had resources, they had technology, for example. They were new kids on the block. So one of the things new kids on the block have is they are less tied in to the the incumbent, the path dependency of what industries are already doing. So they can use that. They're also able to win new resources. So there's a company that I know in London which is working on blockchain. So it's been going now for about 5 or 6 years. I believe one of the members of that company's on. Hello, I'm talking about you. And they got, because it was such a good idea, they were able to get quite a lot of backers and build a blockchain interface, as you know, between different types of banks. It's still happening. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's actually an opportunity for startups to find areas which are hitherto not been served. I mean, Kim Cham talks about Blue Ocean, and these are opportunities for startups really to step into that space. So if you're a startup, one of the things, and I do think it goes back to the scanning, is to be scanning around and thinking about, okay, what could I be doing? And is this the opportunity to do it? Because people are looking, because there are still people that do have funds looking to invest somewhere else.
And what I think is really interesting this time is, like you say, some companies are not anticipating, change. They're reacting.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these companies may be too big to fail and taking bailouts. But we also see that the consumer's different. We're seeing, for example, Shake Shack in America, was going to grab money for small businesses. And they had a backlash from customers who said, wait a second, you're not a small business. People, certain companies that are like, we're not going to take the money. And then when they did, there was a backlash. So how do we see that as different? Is that just, does that have to do with individual preferences? Does that have to do with the time of the world where we're living? Do we see that in terms of how people are handling it psychologically too? It's just a way to display anger.
It's interesting. So there's been a piece of research which looks at how do small companies, so there are many different players, aren't there? So there's the small companies themselves. So one, their identity when they start usually is around a particular client group. When they try to expand into new areas and diversify, that client group tends to see themselves as, are we no longer important? Have you just been using us? And that's one way in which them courting with these bigger players as seeing as a form of disloyalty to their core group. And it's actually quite a difficult transition that small companies have to go through, or enterprise companies have to go through. How can they grow without that kind of support, or a new community or a new market, without giving up the old, if you like, loyal customers of the past? And I'm going to come back to this capacity of managing these contradictions as we move forward. Can we go to the next slide, please? And in fact, you could show all these together because I'm not going to spend time on this. What people typically do is have two types of responses, a defensive one or a proactive one. If we look at defensive survival, 3 months, this is what people typically do. Yeah, they freeze investments, they cut costs, they lower inventory, they delay payments on cash, they look for bank overdrafts and stuff like that. But they tend to focus much on that top right-hand corner, it's probably top left-hand corner of defensive strategies. So they're into survival mode. What research says is this is not the way to do it. And I'm going to move on to the next slide because I think there's nothing particularly new in here. So there was a couple of studies which were done by a couple of colleagues in Harvard, which looked at the crisis in 1980-82, early 90s and early 2000, 2002. And they found that there were, again, this concept of how do we respond to crisis, how do we respond to threat? We either go on our front foot or we go defensive. So they had these two types of companies. So one type of company, bottom left, was to cut cost. Yeah. Cut costs right down to the bone. And they thought, well, we'll get through this. But in actual fact, this didn't seem to be a way forward. Fewer companies who, what they call prevention focus, managed to survive and get through to the next round post the crisis. Then there are other types who are more promotion focused. So I draw on Lego. In the case of Citibank, I think they got rid of 50,000 employees during the crisis, the financial crisis. Whereas those who are promotion focused, so they will spend on R&D, they'll try and move out. And Lego particularly, whilst other companies in the toy industry were going down, they went front foot into the Asian market. Yeah, and as a result, they did, for example, even a Lego Taj Mahal even to try and get into the market. And they were actually successful as a company in terms of doing this. So if there's nothing else you take away from this, don't just cut costs. But again, they did well as a group, but they didn't do amazing. So we then move on to say, okay, who were the groups that really did amazing? So there were those who were what we call pragmatic. They did a bit of promotion and a bit of defensive strategy, a bit of cost, but it wasn't really strategic. They just thought, well, add a bit here and take a little bit here. And they did a mixed strategy. But the people that really did well, and they call them progressives, they deployed optimal strategies. So for example, if we take Costco, I mean, it's not what we might describe as a sexy business, but what they did was they closed down loss-making sites, for example, and yet increased the number of employees. So they were very strategic, both in terms of their offensive, both in terms of R&D and CapEx, as well as defensive. Samsung, again, while other companies were going down, if I take Sony, for example, they were expanding, being proactive, as well as being defensive. And these companies, particularly among the progressives, what they do is to manage the contradictions. And contradictions are interconnected polarities. And I think that's what we're managing now in the crisis. So the contradictions, I think, on one hand, are to do with health and people. And on the other hand, to do with, dare I say, money, profits, maintaining the economy. And I think those that are successful, Taiwan, Korea, I can't think of others who've been able to do this, have been able to move through. And I think it's true as well for companies. If we move on to the next slide, what I'm going to say to you now is not going to surprise you. Those companies who are successful, what made them different, I'm afraid to say, was their leadership. And many of you asked about, so what do leaders have to do with this? And I think the way leaders really play a role is in the sensing part. And by leaders here, I'm not talking only of individual players, because there is a sort of iconic leader that we have who's usually male and all the things that go with it. But I'm talking about leadership teams, particularly. Yeah? And based on some study that I did with a couple of colleagues, particularly a guy called Lee White, when I was in another place, we found that there were 4 types of kind of leadership styles around managing that front part of dynamic capabilities. They were, how far did you strategically scan? And secondly, did you have good interpretive abilities? Did you make sense of it, in other words? So obviously down in the bottom left-hand corner, they were introspective. I call these people operating psychic prisons. They really had no clue about what's going on. And if you like, that reflected that bank that I talked about in the first slide. Then there were those I call inept. So they did a lot of scanning, but really didn't make sense of the data whatsoever. In fact, they may have even distorted it. I think it's called fake news now. Or in some ways, were in denial, which is another thing we've talked about. In the bottom right-hand corner, we had those who were more, what you might call low on strategic thinking, more on strategic scanning rather, but had that kind of sense, that sixth sense that we talk about. They're instinctive and they're intuitive, and some of these people actually continue to do well. So the studies which show about narcissistic leaders, apparently they just go with whatever they feel works for them. Their returns are no worse or better than others. Yeah. However, the variance is huge. Yeah. So this is the thing about them. So at some level, if you have a gut instinct, and I think this is true about entrepreneurs as well, they have this gut instinct, they just go with it. The variance is high in terms of performance, but they don't do any better or any worse. And then finally, there are these insightful folk. And insightful folk are able to interpret in a very sophisticated way. And also they're able to manage these contradictions. And in the work that we're looking at now, managing contradictions, I think is going to be one of the big competencies that we're going to be talking about moving forward and thinking about organizational change.
And Michael, we've been getting quite a few questions about how do teams get better at that sense dynamic, capability? How do you hone that and grow that?
Yeah. So there are three things I think they need. I mean, and there are many more, so I'm just picking three which are most significant. So one, what we know about teams, and particularly top management teams, is that diversity. So, and this is what we love about INSEAD, but diversity is one of the major things. And why is because you bring different cognitive schemas to the world, i.e. you see things in different ways. And we know this helps, particularly during periods of uncertainty where there are no answers. Where we have routine problems, we know if you're all, if it's a homogeneous group, maybe by industry or by culture, then it's a well-known problem, it's well-defined. Here's you can cut and paste this. And I think during these times, we cannot use templates or what they call them, cookie cutter responses. Yeah, we need to use these diverse things. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we need to integrate what we call something called behavioral integration. Behavioral integration, and this is work which has been done by a whole bunch of people on top management teams. They need to be not only thinking about the sensing and stuff, but also sharing information. There needs to be high flows of information. And also, I'll use the word rather than the word that Hambrick uses, there needs to be high levels of trust. So you need to be able to be collaborative. And I think these are the three things. I mean, there are other things I could add, but these are the three things which are important. And obviously this means some form of strategic alignment as well. So I think these are the things that are important. Other questions?
Behavioral integration, how does that become more complex, or how is that more difficult to do things like, build trust and to integrate when we're doing it by Zoom? We're not doing it in person. We're not seeing everyone eye to eye. I even find, sometimes it's even hard to get a word in edgewise because you can't feel the room. How do you compensate for that?
That's a really good question. So since January, since February, I came back and I self-isolated. Again, I came back to Singapore and basically have been in these four walls. I'm not quite going mad yet. And if I am, I'm sure I'll get feedback to that. But I've been doing a lot of calls. So for example, I've done coaching on Zoom. Yeah, at first I thought it was weird. Yeah. In fact, earlier this afternoon I had a session. And what I've found is that between the sessions, there is a new norm that people are actually psychologically getting used to it. So although the calls I did in February compared to the calls now, I'm finding there's more intimacy. So that's the first thing. Secondly, there are other cues. There are lots and lots of other cues. So there's lots of research which shows that we give off non-verbal responses to anything people say. Our eyes, I'm sorry you can't see mine, but I need my glasses to look. Whether in our cheek movements, whether we're furrowed or not, there are lots and lots of non-verbal cues. And maybe I think it's one thing that we begin to pay more attention to this in a way which, when we're in a room, we take it in more at a guttural level. So that's another thing that can happen. And then thirdly, I think there's a whole bunch of rituals we can start with. So for example, if we start a team meeting, you would start with, okay, so how are we all doing? And maybe do a round. And there are meetings I'm having where I'm doing group coaching, where that's exactly how we start a meeting. Okay, before we get down to the task, let's do a social and mental check-in so that we're creating a boundary, a space, a psychological space that we can all buy into. Somebody was also saying, can we manage change or manage culture when we're not together? And the answer is absolutely, because the culture, and this is why I'm going back to the initial point, is not in the bricks and the mortar. The culture is in our mind, it's in the people. And this is where we come down to something called attachment theory. So attachment theory basically says, from a very early age, we form strong attachments to loved ones. Yeah. Typically, obviously, that's the parent when we start with. Yeah. But over time, these attachments grow over time. So it'll be aunts, uncles. Eventually, it's our early bosses who replace our parental figures. And then also our organizations become forms of attachment. And we call this organizational identification. And there's lots of studies which show how we become identified with our organization. So one of our colleagues, Jennifer Petrogelli, talked about when BP, when there was terrible events that happened around Blue Horizon, that people actually felt disgusted, senior leaders felt disgusted of being part. I am not part of this company anymore. Or even in London, I remember during the global financial crisis, bankers would say, are you a banker? No, no, I'm not a banker. So they actually disidentified with the industry. And the point I'm trying to make here is we don't need bricks and mortar to form a culture or to form bonds. They are in the mind. And if you think about the whole theme of what I'm talking about today is how do we hold these things in the mind, from threat to people we have as close relationships to the role of leadership. Yeah. So I think these can continue.
What do you do if your organizational identity is hierarchy or that narcissistic leader who tends to make decisions? You know, if it's not, you know, sensing, if it is not, you know, being insightful, how do you as part of a team try to motivate and push in a different, or maybe right word's not push, into another direction?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So there are different ways you can do that. So there are three things that I've seen different people do. So the first thing is to bring in an external agent. So I don't want to say a consultant, but bring in an external agent who is psychologically tuned to these matters. Yeah. Who will then create the space for us to have, I don't want to say an honest conversation, but to have a more informed conversation. And what we're talking about here is a reality principle. So I actually had we did a change process, an ex-McKinsey consultant and I were working together, trying to help an organization which was in a combination of IT consulting, and they wanted to go and be sold. Yeah, just thinking about it. Anyway, the senior leadership team were ambivalent about it. Yeah, and this is absolutely normal. And there's lots of studies which show if I've set up a company and it's very successful, in my mind, I know it makes absolute sense to, you know, sell on, but there's some ambivalence. And so when we tried to help them, they did everything to undermine the work of the consultants. I mean, everything. And so what we had to do was to find a way of framing it so that we could point out that this person's and this team's behavior was undermining the work that we're doing. So actually you're wasting money. So that was one hook. And then the second one, the main theme we had was look for psychologically, what is in it for them? If we go back to the original theme, how do people respond to threat? They withdraw or they come forward, sometimes in a fighting mode or sometimes because there's some form of risk and reward. And the smart consultant should be able to pick that up and work with it. So what we work with is, so what's your legacy going to be? Okay, yeah, I want this. And that's how we worked with them. And then after that, all of the games, for want of a better word, completely stopped. So that's one thing that I've seen. Another thing I've seen where there's been a group who have I would call a hyper anxious boss. He's obviously under a lot of pressure to meet market performance. So we completely understand it, completely understand it. So what I didn't have direct contact, I had contact with the team, was how and what ways can we help him get the support that he needs, to get the feedback that he needs, and in actual fact, he's undermining the very thing that he's trying to achieve. So those are just two examples of enthusiastic bosses, if you like, who are undermining the very thing that they're trying to achieve.
Thank you.
More questions, because I can see that there are many more. I'm happy to answer
Yes,
questions.
there are. There's quite a few. So how do we encourage leaders to take a more long-term perspective, particularly when they're in a crisis and they're anxious and they're trying to solve the here and the now? How do we keep them in that kind of long-term space?
Okay, let's move down to the next couple of slides, because I think that would be quite helpful. So one, we want them to be in the top right-hand corner rather than the bottom left-hand corner. Secondly, they need to be able to sense as well as be insightful. But thirdly, they need to be able to manage these contradictions, these paradoxes. So if we move to the next slide, I love this quote: the psychology won't just bounce back. Yeah, people have had a real shock. And the reason I like it is because it's not from a psychologist. Yeah, it's from an economist. And the important thing is that we're beginning to really realize the importance of people, the psychological processes that take place, and the importance of really addressing the underlying issues rather than the tactical ones. Okay? And so if there's a big message from my talk this afternoon, is what are the underlying issues that motivate people either to get on board or to withdraw, to engage or disengage? We know psychologically that people are wired this way. And the thing that wires them, if we just focus on the middle bit, because I've talked about the outside, is what we call discrepancy detection. So people have expectations, which if when they're not met, they move into threat anxiety. This is the big thing. So what do we manage there? We either have to manage expectations, in terms of standards, or we have to manage what I call the reality principle, so that we can bring these two things closer and closer together. This is called being an immature adult. Now, in many ways, for whatever reasons, it may be that people have incredibly high expectations of themselves. Maybe for parental reasons, they get lots of positive strokes when they do that. They take that into work. They're successful, and that's the way they work. And if you think about our population, predominantly as MBAs or as high-powered managers, you will have a little bit of that as well. Yeah, you will have a little bit of that, where in fact people don't have to get the the pressure on you. You put more pressure on yourself. So there's a couple of things that we need to do around this. In fact, there was somebody I was working with earlier. Hello, if you're still on, where we were talking about how patterns from the past influence the way in which we take up our roles now. Yeah, and I think this is true for all of us. If we just stop, think and look back about how we do this, is absolutely true. Yeah. Coaching, again, can be very helpful. I can range from, I remember working with somebody who could no longer stand in front of the investors and give a presentation for whatever knows. And I call this a real attack of anxiety. And literally just by us working on it week by week over quite some time, he managed, and I'm quoting, to get his mojo back. So we can understand what happened here. Or another case where somebody, I just remember getting a call, can we have a chat outside of the coaching? And this person never normally does that. And what he was wanting to do is to work in a style which was probably much more aggressive than his normal style. Yeah. But it was required because they were in an emergency, and just helping him to understand how he could be more assertive without being aggressive, which psychologically he associated as being rude or horrible or being less of a person or a bully or something like that. Or again, one other example of somebody had a new job in a senior role, and he had a person who was senior to him, but was in his team. And this person kept not really doing good work, and he just couldn't performance manage him. Why? Because he felt as a senior, as part of his culture, he felt I couldn't tell this person off. And then just bringing it to his attention, he was able then to work through this. So one is I definitely think is coaching. Secondly is about expectation management. And then the third is, I think, is about getting people in touch with what I call the reality principle.
You know, Michael, the questions, we have a very active audience and we don't have that much more time, but I thought this one was really interesting is, will there be a pre and post COVID era regarding organizational behavior? So if, you know, once we get back, and I'm putting this in quotations, normal, once we get back to normal, what will be the three biggest changes that we'll see that will stick, you know, that will stay with us?
That is a great question. Wow, that's a great question. So that's a great question. Let me think. And when you say organizational behavior, I assume we're talking about within the discipline which will apply to organizations in general. Yeah? Yeah.
And I would love to take credit for this question, but it's one of our guests, but I would assume, yes, that would be correct.
So I think one of the things which is going to be top of mind is a real understanding and much more sensitivity to the needs of people. We have for several decades been talking that people are our greatest asset. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm not convinced. Yeah. Even now we see, and I don't want to point fingers, but one of the companies that is doing rather well out of this crisis is not really treating its people that well. And we're seeing them out demonstrating, saying, look, we're not being treated well. And I think even now it's being, so I think this is definitely going to be one of the things that come first and foremost. The second thing I think is about changing social relationships. One of the things about, I mean, things like even having what we have now, media like this, internet, people working from home. A couple of our colleagues had, what's it like working with partners? I've had emails from friends saying, I'm going to kill my son, or we're going to have more babies, or we're going to have a divorce. I mean, changing of social relation, the boundary between what's inside and what is outside is going to be much more fluid. And I think we're going to have more challenges in how we manage this. I remember one of the questions was, how do we manage change? Is it possible virtually? I'm going to come back to your question. And the answer is definitely, absolutely. I had one person I was working with about 4 weeks ago, and he actually negotiated a really hard contract virtually. So they'd had a couple of contacts before, for sure. But this is the hard knuckle stuff, 2-hour conversation over Zoom, and they were able to make these negotiations. Similarly, in terms of rolling out a new way of working, he's done one-to-ones, small groups, even run a town hall, which media can allow you to do that. So the second one is changing relationships. The third one, we've talked about virtual teams forever, haven't we? And this is, in some ways, has been a special case. I can see all my team-based colleagues who've been talking about virtual teams thinking, I'm king or queen at last, yeah? I do think the whole virtuality is going to be part of us, and I think technology will change with that as well. So we already know we can have implants. So people already have been testing implants. If you think and link that to artificial intelligence, I think we're going to see that accelerating. At the moment, we have what's called augmented intelligence, i.e. how can what we do as humans be enhanced by artificial intelligence rather than machines really taking over. And I think we're going to see more of that as well. So those are my, I don't want to call them predictions, those are my thoughts among many others for that question.
And so,
can we move down to the last, Yes, can we move down to the last slide?
Because we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay. I've already made points about the first 2 points. So ego defenses, social defenses, which operate at an organizational level where we have denial and all those things, or people look for, you know, what is it that's making a change for me going forward? But the ultimate question, which answer to the question I think was implied behind this is, so what can I do as a leader? And the theme that I want to come up to is this idea of self-containment. And this is the capacity to manage one's own anxieties, one's own worries, which you have to do first before you can manage those of others, the team, which is a question you asked very early on. But I wanted to build on that, all the different elements. Now, by containment, I think there are lots of different ways we can do this. So at a very basic level, self-awareness definitely helps. Yeah? It's realizing I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling whatever, anxious. One thing you could do simply, deep breathing and count to 10. I mean, let's just try it all together. Let's just as an experiment. Yeah. So breathing in and then literally breathe out and let all the tension drop from your head, from your shoulders. Breathe in. Let the tensions drop from your shoulders, from your arms, begin to feel loose. Breathe in. Breathing out, let the body begin to drop, feel more and more relaxed. Breathe in. If you're on a seat, let the legs begin to feel more relaxed. And then finally breathing in. And then release as you feel your feet making a touch with the ground. So something as simple as that can calm you down. Going further, you can meditate. For some of you already do that. You can meditate. There are many of you I know that do sports. So sports is a great way of releasing stress because that's what you're building up here. Another way is counseling, therapy, coaching. These are all ways in which you can get much more self-awareness and what I would call self-agency. And if you're able to do these things, you'll have more capacity to be able to help others. I don't know if we have time for one more question.
I think we do. So we do have the very last poll, which is asking, people on a scale of 1 to 10, what do they think they can, the actions they can take to manage themselves in the current crisis. So we'd love to have people answer that and we can get the responses. I think what's interesting is we talk about leaders self-containment. How can we coach those people who are part of our leadership team or that report to us? How can we coach them through and help them to be better at self-containment?
Yeah. So I think that, again, just very quickly, 3 things. So 1, to model it. Yeah. If we're not doing it, people are not going to follow us. Yeah. That's the first thing. 2, to give positive feedback to people when they do it. Yeah. And then thirdly, to give constructive feedback in the right time. So not because you can give feedback just to give it, but to be able to time it so that it's really well focused.
That's great.
So I wish I'd taken this poll at the beginning as well. There's a high sense of agency in this group, and that's amazing. That's great. Very few are in the 1, 2, 3, or 4 category, and most are in the 7 and 8 and above. I would like to have thought that as you've got more information and we're able to help you relax and move through the process that you got there, but my sense is that you already came with it. What did we learn from all of this? And let me just go to the very last slide. And I think we can put them all out together, Julia. 1, we do know dynamic capabilities make a difference. Research shows that, but only when periods are more changing. And so I think from an OB point of view, from organizational theory point of view, we're going to see people drawing much more on this. Secondly, there's no template. You need to figure it out. And that is getting the right combinations. What we know, even if you don't get the right combinations correct, which leads me to the 3rd point, having strategic leadership which scan and intelligently interpret, you do well, you can do better. Thirdly, we must learn from the past and from the present. Learning from the present is called improvisation. This is doing and learning at the same time. So learn from the present and look back as well. And then finally, being able to manage these contradictions. This is the big thing. So it means doing the operational efficiency and treating our people well. It might be having what we call co-opetition. So we cooperate with our competition. Yeah. So these are the big 5 for me in terms of key takeaways. I hope you've enjoyed it. I had a great time with you. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Katie, who will now close our session.
Thank you, Michael. That was fabulous. And I think it's very comforting to know that all leaders are struggling with managing contradictions. I think that we are, in a time where it is, you know, we hear one thing and then hear the other. And it's good to know that there are steps we can take to become better leaders and to and really become self-contained and to care for others, and to really, like you said, for the leaders after coronavirus, is really understanding that people are our greatest asset. It's a great message. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who were on this call today. We had so much information, we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but the great news is that we will collect all of these questions and we will continue the discussion on the lifelong learning website, which is part of LinkedIn. So we'll share all of those questions, and we really hope that you can continue to engage on this topic. There were so many interesting questions that I would love to hear what you have to say, and what other experts in the field who were participating in this conversation today. Michael gave us some great food for thought, and so it would be wonderful to continue the conversation. We also have some upcoming webinars. We would love for you to attend. If you just go to the nci.edu/COVID-19 website, you can find out more details and register. And last but not least, you will receive a Qualtrics survey after this. We'd love to hear your feedback. As I mentioned earlier, this was our 10th webinar. We're going to continue to do this and want to continue to deliver the information that you're interested in hearing about and answering the questions that are most front of mind. And with that, thank you so much, Michael. You were fabulous. We really appreciate it today. I learned so much. I have my own notes for myself. For everyone, please stay healthy, stay well, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.